Tony Hawk games might be forgotten, but during their golden days, they surely had a big influence on the gaming industry. Amongst popular sport games that changed the market, the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater franchise has to be one of the top 3. The first 4 games in this series sold millions of copies all over the world and took skateboarding to a whole other level. Kids started buying skateboards and the sport was more popular than ever, even resulting in a few movies being made about skateboarding. The franchise went from an extremely successful beginning to a not so successful continuation.
Tony Hawk Ride is a big mess.
Although the franchise didn't really affect what we see in store shelves today, it sure did back then. Neversoft, the company behind the first 9 games in the Tony Hawk series, was founded in 1994 by Joel Druett, Chris Ward, and Mike West. The first game developed by the company was a Sega Saturn game called Skeleton Warriors, based on the TV series of the same name. The game became a success and was the beginning for Neversoft. The company began designing their own game shortly afterwards called Big Guns, a product that was later bought by Sony Entertainment. Sony cancelled the game in November 1997 and Neversoft was struggling financially. Activision luckily saved them. They were looking for a company to develop a shooter game called Apocalypse and saw promise in the engine used in Big Guns. While Neversoft signed on to develop Apocalypse, they also signed on to develop a prototype for a skateboarding game, which was also requested by Activision. Neversoft's original idea for a skateboarding game was to make a downhill racing game with skateboards. All the levels were supposed to look like the classic Downhill Jam level, and the goal in the game was to get to the finish line first, rather than scoring a million points in a combo. To not get bored when waiting for a friend at the finish line, Neversoft added a skate park in the end of every level. When they realized that people came to the finish line in less than 20 seconds and spent the next minute doing tricks in a skate park, Neversoft changed the whole structure of the game, which will later be known as Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. After finishing working on Apocalypse, the 50-man team all worked on Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. They used the same engine as in Apocalypse. The first character to ever stand on a board in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater was no other than Bruce Willis, who played the main role in Apocalypse. To try and convince Tony Hawk to join the project, Neversoft took a demo to him. Tony Hawk was impressed by the demo and joined the project immediately. Each time Neversoft finished a new build of the game, a copy was sent to Tony Hawk for review. If he noticed anything that didn't appear to reflect real-life skateboarding, he would report it to Neversoft. A disc giving out at Pizza Hut restaurants in America included the first demo of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. The demo allowed players to control Tony Hawk in Warehouse and Chicago. Activision did not expect Tony Hawk's Pro Skater to become a hit at the market, so they gave Neversoft a budget of around $150,000 to work with. The real-life skaters featured in the game got a small cut of the profits. On August 31st, 1999, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, also known as Tony Hawk Skateboarding in other countries, was released for the PlayStation. The game was a commercial success and received extremely positive reviews. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater has sold 9.5 million copies worldwide, making it the 4th best-selling sports game of all time. The game had a career mode, a single session mode, and free skate mode. In career mode, the goal was to get all the free medals from free skateboarding competitions. To get there, you had to complete several tasks at other levels, like collecting the SKAT letters, getting a high score, and finding the secret tape. The player only had 2 minutes to complete the tasks, but could restart the session once it was over. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater was highly praised. You could combine grind tricks, flip tricks, and grab tricks in one combo. With all of them together, players could wrap up a lot of points, which is something the Tony Hawk games later became known for. What the game was perhaps most praised for was the soundtrack. It included songs from bands like Dead Kennedys, Goldfinger, Primus, and the Suicide Machines. The success of the PlayStation version of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater led to Activision hiring other companies like the then unknown Treyarch to make portions of the game for Dreamcast and Nintendo 64. The extreme success of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater resulted in a sequel being made, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, that was released in 2000. Activision saw a great potential in the franchise and decided to give Neversoft a much bigger budget to work with. During 1999, Neversoft was split into two teams. One was working on the next Tony Hawk game, while the other team was working on a new Spider-Man game. For Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, Neversoft expanded the game by creating bigger levels and a longer career mode. The biggest new feature in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 was the creative mode. You could now customize your own skater and skate park. In Pro Skater 2, the options were a bit limited in comparison to future Tony Hawk games, but at the time it was original for any game to have something as unique as a creative mode. The career mode was similar to the first game in the series, but a lot bigger. On the levels there were now 10 goals instead of just 5, and a lot of the new levels include some very cool secret spots. Another new addition to Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 was the manual, which made you able to link your combos via flatland tricks. You could either play the career mode with your own created skater or with any of the real-life skaters included, but if you play the career multiple times, you could unlock some very special things. Spider-Man was featured as a secret skater you could unlock when completing the game once. This was the first ever licensed skater included in the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater franchise, but there were way more to come. In South Korea, 4 additional playable skaters were in the game, from the Korean pop band Fin KL, and 8 of their songs were featured as well. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 is ranked as the second best game of all time on Metacritic.com, just behind The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. The game sold 2 million copies in its first week and led Activision into seeking more opportunities with the franchise. Activision created a trademark for their action sport games called Activision O2. Activision hired new companies to develop other extreme sport games such as a BMX game known as Matt Hoffman's Pro BMX, a snowboarding game known as Sean Palmer's Pro Snowboarder, a surfing game called Kelly Slater's Pro Surfer, and a wakeboarding game. All of the games use the exact same engine as in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. These games had a very limited success. The first Matt Hoffman game was met with great response and even spawned a sequel for the 6th generation of consoles. But people weren't really interested in other extreme sport games, and there were already similar games at the gaming market, such as SSX and Damer's Pro BMX. The Tony Hawk's Pro Skater games were revolutionary, but the other Activision O2 trademark games lacked originality, which led Activision into focusing more on Tony Hawk games instead of publishing as many extreme sport games as possible. The Activision O2 trademark was quickly gone. Vicarious Vision, a game developing company that made ports for popular games, were hired by Activision to make handheld ports of the Tony Hawk games. In the start, there were only Game Boy versions of the Tony Hawk games, but the Game Boy ports were the most praised handheld ports of the Tony Hawk games. The Game Boy versions worked quite differently than the originals, but they did for most part always include the new features like manual, revert, and getting off your board. The games, however, had a way different camera angle and were a lot harder to control. The level designs were also a lot different, but this is of course pretty obvious since a handheld system wasn't near as capable back then as they are now. The PlayStation 2 arrived in the year of 2000. Neversoft saw new opportunities in this and began working with the renderware engine and added another feature requested by Activision, to make Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 the first ever PS2 game with online mode. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 was released in October 2001. Pro Skater 3 really felt like an extreme upgrade with a much better look. The career mode was the same as in the first 2 Tony Hawk games, but Pro Skater 3 introduced the revert to the series, a trick that enabled vert combos to be tied together with a manual by tapping a button when landing in a quarter pipe. This allowed for much longer combos than in the previous 2 games, where landing in a quarter pipe would finish a combo. As mentioned, the other big feature for the game was the online mode, which was only included in the PlayStation 2 version and the PC version. Users could connect directly to other players online on the PlayStation 2 version, even prior to the launch of the network adapter with a USB Ethernet adapter. When online, you could play several game modes on the 9 beautiful levels in the game with up to 4 players on the PS2 version and 8 players on the PC. The Xbox version didn't have online due to unknown reasons, but it did include system link play, as well as an extra level and a character that didn't appear in the other versions of the game. A level called Paris was supposed to be the extra level for the GameCube version, but the development of the level was cancelled. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 was bigger than Pro Skater 2 in every possible way, by even including more secret skaters like Wolverine, Darth Maul, and even Kelly Slater. The game was released to wide praise by critics. Neversoft debuted extremely well on a 6th generation of consoles. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 received 97 out of 100 on Metascore and is ranked as the 12th best game of all time on Metacritic.com. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 sold 2 million copies in its opening week and brought the series to a whole other level. A last-gen port of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 was released for Nintendo 64 and PlayStation. It was developed by Shaba Games. The ports used the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 engine and did include a revert, but the ports were criticized for not having near enough new stuff as the next-gen versions had, but the PS1 and N64 port were still good. A year later in 2002, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 was released. While keeping the same engine as the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, the fourth game introduced a lot of new features that would be the basis for all the later installments in the Tony Hawk series. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 featured a career mode similar to freeskate mode, in which there was no time limit to explore the level. The goals were usually offered to the player to attempt by characters found in the level. From completing goals in the story, you got cash which you could buy new stuff for, like levels, tricks and more. Another new feature introduced was the sketching, which let skaters hang off the back of moving vehicles. The game was also a lot easier to pick up and play, and many tricks that were previously known as hidden combos and special tricks in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 were now standard ones. This only made it a lot more enjoyable to play. Once again, the online mode was exclusive for the PS2 and PC version, but in 2002, Xbox players had figured out a way to trick the system into thinking that it was playing system link play while you were actually playing online. So it wasn't really a problem for the Xbox players anymore at this point. The soundtrack in the game was expanded, including more than twice as many songs as in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 from many bands. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 was another highly praised Tony Hawk game by both critics and gamers. For the next game, which was going to be Tony Hawk's Underground, Neversoft decided to create a skateboarding game with the theme of individuality. In the previous Tony Hawk games, you always chose a skater to play with, and there wasn't really any type of story in any of them. Tony Hawk's Underground starts an amateur skater in a story mode about you. Yes, you and your friend Eric Sparrow. You and Eric are trying to become the world's best skaters. The story in the game was actually surprisingly good, featuring the Twilight Zone twist and excitement, but the story wasn't really for everyone. Some people criticized it for not really being about just skateboarding, but being about doing criminal acts. A lot of people complained about Pro Skater 4 being too hard, so in Underground, Neversoft also introduced difficulty settings to the story. Most of the levels in Tony Hawk's Underground were modeled closely after real-world locations. The designers traveled to locations representative of each city in the game and took photographs and videos as reference. But the story wasn't the biggest new feature in Underground. The biggest was the ability to get off your board. You could now climb up ladders, jump up buildings, and much more. But driving, which was another new thing to the game, was heavily criticized by players. As of 2007, the game has sold 2.7 million copies in North America only, making it one of the most commercial successful games in the franchise. It also received positive reviews and is personally my second favorite Tony Hawk game of all time. A sequel for the game was released a year later called Tony Hawk's Underground 2. It featured a follow-up storyline to the first game where the same custom skater participates in the World Destruction Tour. It was basically Team Hawk vs Team Bam, and your skater was on Team Hawk. The story was pretty similar to Viva La Bam. You went to different cities to get destruction points by breaking stuff and fighting secret skaters. The story was however linear, and the player couldn't affect it, and no matter what you did, the story had the same ending and cutscenes. Underground 2 was, except for the story, fairly similar to Underground. A classic mode was however added to Underground 2, which allowed players to skate through both new and remade levels in the traditional 10 goal 2 minute time limit mode that was present in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, complete with the stat points scattered all around the levels. There were, however, only 7 remade levels in the game, and the rest of the levels in the classic mode were from the story mode, so it wasn't really that fun to play through the classic mode, to be honest. Classic mode was, in my opinion, a pretty bad feature to add, and it would later kind of ruin the series in a way. It was a good idea, but it was just repetitive and unoriginal. It would have been better if the story mode was longer and had more levels, because it only took 2 hours to complete. You could of course replay the story on different difficulty settings, but the story wasn't even good from the start. And Underground 2 didn't include near as much useful added features to the gameplay. You could test your creativity and create your own goals if you missed the story from Tony Hawk's Underground. But the customization for Create a Goal, a feature they added in Underground 1, was also fairly limited. Tony Hawk's Underground 2 wasn't a bad game, it just wasn't near as good as the previous 5 games in the series. Sure, some of the levels in the game were really great, but this was when the Tony Hawk games started going downhill. With that being said, unnecessary features were added, like driving go-karts, graffiti, sticker slap and more. The game was still successful and received pretty good reviews. But the PSP port for the game, which was released 6 months later after Tony Hawk's Underground 2, was actually just like the PS2, Xbox and GameCube version. Tony Hawk's Underground 2 Remix also included 4 new levels that were all going to be remade in the next original Tony Hawk title that came out the same year in October. American Wasteland was the 7th game in the series and the first game in the franchise to be released on the 7th generation of consoles, Xbox 360. Development was not entirely focused on the Xbox 360 version, however. Instead, the next gen version was nearly identical to the PS2, Xbox and GameCube version. After Pro Skater 4, Neversoft started to focus more on improving the story mode in the game instead of improving the gameplay, and Tony Hawk's American Wasteland surely proved that. The game tells the story of a runaway skater who's tired of the life in the Midwest and goes to Los Angeles with dreams of skating on spots that made skateboarding famous in the first place. When arriving in Hollywood, the skater of course gets all his stuff stolen, but Custom Skater meets a girl named Mindy who offers to help you out and teaches you a few skate tricks. She eventually hooks you up with her crew, a group of criminal skaters that are building an enormous skate park known as the Skate Ranch. A big part of what you did in the story mode was stealing various bits of scenery for the Skate Ranch, like the Hollywood sign and more. Tony Hawk's American Wasteland was the first game in the Tony Hawk franchise that allowed players to play in one large level without loading times in between. However, what the game did offer was a tunnel or anything similar to skate through while the game was loading the next area, so the whole open world thing wasn't really that true and was heavily criticized. The game was also the first game in the series that allowed players to ride a BMX. You could do this in the story mode, and some goals even required it. The BMX was controlled completely different than the skateboard, but wasn't hard to get used to. Tony Hawk's American Wasteland also included over 10 original unreleased songs in the game. In this case, it was covers of famous songs from bands like Fall Out Boy, My Chemical Romance and Dropkick Murphys. The soundtrack for the game reached number 148 on the Billboard Top 200, which was the highest ever for a Tony Hawk game soundtrack. All versions of the game except for the GameCube version included online mode, and the classic mode from Tony Hawk's Underground 2 returned in American Wasteland. This time, the classic mode featured no levels from the story mode, but 5 remade levels from the previous games and 1 original. The classic mode was very short, but enjoyable, and you could even play a split screen on it. Although the game received generally positive reviews, it was still the worst reviewed title in the franchise so far. A Nintendo DS and Game Boy version of the game was released, called Tony Hawk's American Skateland, developed by Vicarious Visions. It was loosely based on American Wasteland, featuring the same environment but a different story. With the next generation of consoles just around the corner, Neversoft could now fully focus on developing their first Tony Hawk game for the 7th generation of consoles. The 8th game in the series would not be known as Tony Hawk 8, but Tony Hawk's SPORADIC 8. The game focused way less on the story mode compared to the previous 3 installments in the franchise, and instead improved the gameplay as much as possible. The game looked extremely fresh and new, and included a storyline about a competition Tony Hawk started called Project 8. Tony is looking for the best skaters in town, and your goal is of course to be one of the best 8 skaters. You started off at rank 200, and as you completed more goals you ranked up. Instead of picking a difficulty, there were now 3 rankings on every goal you could complete: Am, Pro and Sick. For example, if the goal was to grind a rail, Am could be grinding 50% of it, Pro could be 75% of it, and Sick was 100. Depending on what difficulty you completed the tasks on, you could rank up easier and even get a different ending. Project 8 featured one giant streaming city to skate in, which contained various skate parks and hidden sections. Most of the levels in the game were basically recreations of classic Tony Hawk's Pro Skater maps like Suburbia, Downtown, Fun Park and Factory. The biggest new feature in the game was the Nail the Trick option. When a player entered this mode, the camera would zoom in on the side to focus on the skateboard and the character's feet. Players were then able to use the right analog stick and left analog sticks to control the feet, allowing the player to flip and rotate the board in any such manner, including tapping the underside of the board in the air and merging various techniques to form new moves. This was a very cool feature at first, but you didn't really use the Nail the Trick option except for when a goal required it. Another new ability in the game was to control the characters in the game during crashes, allowing you to obtain a high hospital bill, with bonus money awarded for broken bones. However, most of the so-called new features were only included in the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 version. The last gen ports for Xbox, PlayStation 2 and PlayStation Portable were slightly different. The ports didn't have an open world, but instead forced players to sit through a loading screen when they wanted to go to a new area. Nail the Trick worked a lot differently, and the slam mode wasn't even included. It was still a pretty fun port, since it used the old engine created for the 6th generation of consoles. For the first time ever, the Xbox 360 version was exclusive with the online mode. That was because the development of PlayStation Network wasn't finished when Neversoft were done with Tony Hawk's Project 8, and they wanted Tony Hawk's Project 8 to be one of the launch games for PS3. It was still an enjoyable experience, and Project 8 was a great game that was well received. Another spin-off title in the Tony Hawk series came out the same year in November 2006, called Tony Hawk's Downhill Jam. Neversoft didn't have any involvement in this game, but Toys for Bob and Supervillain Studios, an indie game company started by Steve Ganem, developed the game. Downhill Jam was based on the original idea for the Tony Hawk games. It's a downhill racing game with skateboards. The game was the first entry for the Tony Hawk games on the Nintendo Wii and included some pretty cool controls. Downhill Jam was sadly very short and not too hard to complete, but it was an enjoyable experience. The game just wasn't like any other games in the franchise. In 2007, the skateboarding game genre was taken to a whole new level. EA released a skateboarding game called Skate, developed by Blackbox, an incredibly realistic skate game simulator that used completely different controls than the Tony Hawk games. EA Skate was a highly praised game, and it was almost impossible to discuss the game without mentioning Tony Hawk. EA Skate was released in September 2007. A month later, Tony Hawk's Proving Ground would come out, and there was a lot of competition between the two games. When Tony Hawk's Proving Ground was released, it wasn't met with good reviews. Neversoft officially lost the competition between Blackbox when Skate completely outsold Tony Hawk's Proving Ground. This was due to many reasons. Tony Hawk's Proving Ground featured the same gameplay from earlier Tony Hawk games, but also added a few new features like Nail the Manual and Nail the Grab. Except for that, the game really didn't have much new. It featured a pretty similar storyline, a very similar structure to the different missions in the game, and a big world like in Tony Hawk's Project 8. Sadly, the level design for Tony Hawk's Proving Ground was completely uninspiring and heavily criticized. The world resembled Washington DC, Baltimore and Philadelphia. There was a new thing to the game called Rigger Mode, that you could place different skate objects in the world. This mode was nearly impossible to control and very hard to use. The video editor mode featured in the game wasn't bad, but you had to start yourself. If you did a sick trick and then cap it, well, sucks to be you. Tony Hawk's Proving Ground was also the first game since Pro Skater 4 to not feature any type of ending. Overall, it was a pretty big disappointment, but Neversoft still celebrated success with Guitar Hero 3 Legends of Rock. The game sold 2.5 million copies worldwide. Activision wanted Neversoft to continue developing the Guitar Hero games, Because of the failure with Tony Hawk's Proving Ground, Neversoft left the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater series forever, after 9 years and 9 games. On December 3rd, 2008, Activision announced a new motion sensing balance board and that players would put down the controller, step on the board and feel the sensation of going big. Shift your weight to turn and balance grinds, kick back on the tail of the board to ollie, and lean into airs to pull off huge spins. A developer was also announced, Robomodo, an indie game development company from Chicago. The game was released in November 2009, and the name was changed to Tony Hawk Ride. The player used the skateboard peripheral to simulate the riding of an actual skateboard in the game. The peripheral, which was shaped just like a real skateboard, was equipped with infrared sensors to detect motion and display it on screen. This of course sounded promising to everyone, but didn't work out at all. The board used for the game felt a lot more like a snowboard, and the game was priced at $120 US. The game received very negative reviews but sold 114,000 copies on its release. That might not sound like a lot, but it was clearly enough to convince Activision to make a sequel called Tony Hawk Shred, which was released in 2010. This time though, the game completely failed. Priced at $120 US, Tony Hawk Shred sold a total of 3,000 copies worldwide, and the Tony Hawk franchise was put on hold for a long time. But at the Spike Video Game Awards, something very big was announced that shocked all fans of the series. A remake of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, developed by Robomodo for the 7th generation of consoles, was announced. Wow, just wow. A trailer for the game was also released at the Spike Video Game Awards, showing Tony Hawk skateboarding in Warehouse in brand new beautiful looking graphics. Fans all over the world were incredibly excited for the game that was called Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD. But there were a lot of questions from fans about the game, like, is it a port or a remake of the older Tony Hawk games? Will it include manuals, revert, and will it include the original soundtrack? Through Robomodo's Facebook fan page for Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD, fans could ask their questions and Robomodo answered quickly if they were allowed to. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD was going to be a remake of the first 2 games in the series for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. It would include manual, and it was quickly announced that Activision had obtained rights for 6 songs from the original 2 Tony Hawk games. The game finally came out in July 2012 for the Xbox 360 and was met with very mixed reviews. It came out in August for the PlayStation 3. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD included most things from the first Tony Hawk's Pro Skater game, but way less from the second. There were 7 levels in the game: Warehouse, School 2, Hangar, the Mall, Downhill Jam, Venice and Marseille. The career mode in the game was exactly like the one in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. You had 2 minutes to complete several goals on one of the 7 levels, and as you completed more tasks, you unlocked new levels, new tricks and more. At first, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD was absolutely brilliant, but it quickly became a big mess. The physics were the absolute biggest problem. The game was developed using the Unreal Engine, which clearly turned out to be the wrong engine for a skateboarding game. Sure, you could do basic tricks, but it was basically impossible to do big combos, the thing that the Tony Hawk games are famous for. The game also didn't have a split screen mode. It might not sound like a big issue, but it truly disappointed many fans of the series. So why didn't Robomodo simply add split screen mode to the game instead of the incredibly bad online mode that died a month after the release of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD? The game sold well on the Xbox Live Arcade Store and PlayStation Store, and a PC port for the game was released on Steam. The game was still heavily criticized by fans of the series, especially when the Revert pack came out in December 2012, which added the Revert to the game as well as 3 levels from Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. Revert worked absolutely horrible, and even if you did 100 reverts after each other, your skater didn't slow down. The levels added were also not so fun to skate around in with the Unreal Engine. The Tony Hawk series was put on hold again after Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD, and there wasn't a single Tony Hawk game released in 2013. In 2014, Tony Hawk announced a new game, which later turned out to be a phone game called Tony Hawk Shred Session. The game basically worked like Temple Run with skateboards and received incredibly poor reviews before its international release, which forced Activision into cancelling their release completely. The Tony Hawk series looked completely dead for a while, but that was until Tony Hawk, on the 7th of November 2014, announced on his Twitter that a new game was in development. A month later, it was announced that the game was coming out on PS4 and Xbox One this year in 2015. Nothing new was heard about the game for months until Tony Hawk finally announced it at Game Informer. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5 is the name of the new Tony Hawk game, and it's a direct sequel to Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4, which came out 13 years ago. The game looks incredibly promising, with features such as Creator Park returning for the first time in 8 years. Could Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5 possibly be the comeback for the Tony Hawk games?